まもなく開議いたします。
We are going to start soon. Please switch your cell phone to the manner mode, silent mode.
それでは
At this point in time, we would like to start the seminar. Thank you very much for attending the MPA Seminar co-hosted allied event of the Tokyo International Film Festival. Let me introduce myself. I am Hiroyuki Murakami. I am with the Japan International Motion Picture Copyright Association. I ask for your kind support. First of all, on behalf of the organizers, Mr. Charles Rivkin, Chairman and CEO of Motion Picture Association, will greet you via video message.
Thank you for the introduction, Murakami-san. And first of all, my apologies again for being unable to be with you in person this year as we all continue to contend with the challenges of this global pandemic. I am truly honored to be invited to address this gathering of some of the best minds committed to improving the digital ecosystem. And what an important topic this is for our industry. And before I continue, I want to extend my deep appreciation to those long-term partners and friends for hosting this year's event, including Hiroyasu Ando, chairman of the Tokyo International Film Festival, and our co-organizers and partners, Uni Japan. We also appreciate the support of so many distinguished members of the Japanese government, and I won't name them all individually, but I assure you that we know and appreciate all of you for your support. I am really delighted to see that films are starting to return to Japanese cinemas, and legal streaming services are just flourishing in Japan. Our member studios have always respected and appreciated Japan's extraordinary culture and its contemporary content, including movies and TV, anime, and manga. We are proud to partner with you in so many different ways. I've also always appreciated that great civilizations like Japan have proverbs that are centuries old and remain deeply relevant to modern life. And there's one Japanese proverb that I think lends itself to the subject matter at hand today. The proverb goes like this: "He who sits in the shade won't take an axe to the tree." As our industry works to restore its growth and momentum, that proverb could easily be applied to our digital ecosystem. If we continue to take the axe to our tree, if we allow piracy to continue unchallenged and unchecked, we will lose the enormous benefits that the shade brings. And those benefits are many, but they include the opportunities for young filmmakers who dream of bringing their stories to the screen, the infusion we bring to economies, and the sheer satisfaction that we give to audiences, the happiness, the entertainment, the artistry. All these benefits hang in the balance because piracy remains an existential threat to our industry around the world, including in the Asia Pacific. In Japan alone, for example, a study that we sponsored found that in 2020, there were 2,780 pirate domains offering illegal content to consumers. And that led to 290 million visits every single month. This year, we're going to release an updated study that finds an even higher levels of piracy. And that's why this seminar is so important, to share this and other information, to learn about best practices, and yes, to revisit the debate across Japan about finding a balance between addressing piracy and preserving individual rights and freedoms. It can be done, as markets like Germany attest, and many, many Japanese experts concur. The most important thing is to recognize the importance of preserving and protecting our digital ecosystem, especially by such measures as site blocking. An international expert will, for example, talk about the success of site blocking in Australia. You'll hear how Google is working with us to close the front door to piracy through site blocking, but they're also working with us to protect creators and producers through the back door, through delisting, which prevents piracy when you use Google searches. And together, site blocking and delisting really work, yielding as much as a 40% bonus for legal copyright owners. And we look forward to Japan's leadership and investment in the eventual adoption of site blocking legislation. Why? So that we can continue to protect our precious digital ecosystem, so that we can continue to see films like Hokusai about the world-renowned artist Ashu Katsu, a touching film about contemplating life after retirement, so that we can continue to enjoy popular anime titles like Naruto and Attack on Titan, much loved by audiences around the world, and so that we can write together another important chapter in the proud narrative of this great industry. There are many more distinguished guests who are going to join us today, but I'm going to leave the honor of naming them to our Master of Ceremonies, Murakami-san. So once again, thank you for allowing me to address this wonderful gathering, and may today's seminar lead to continuing and fruitful discussions about this extremely important topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next, the joint organizer of this seminar is the Tokyo International International Film Festival, and we have Chairman Hiroyasu Ando, who will be giving his opening remarks. How do you do, everybody? As one of the co-organizers, I would like to make my opening remarks. As Chairman Rivkin has said, he has given a very wonderful and passionate speech talking about the essence of the problem we are dealing with. So there's very little for me to talk about, but I would like to say a few words here. Usually, for the Tokyo International Film Festival, we have this MPA Seminar that is held at the same time in Roppongi. Unfortunately, this year, we have relocated to the Ginza Yurakucho area for the film festival. This is because we wanted to have a wider participation in the film festival, but unfortunately we can no longer share the same location as the MPA seminar, and I'm sorry about this. COVID-19 has stabilized here in Japan, and it's unfortunate that we could not see guests from abroad come this time. And there are some people who say that there is the sixth wave of coronavirus that will be coming, so we have to be careful. But we are seeing more positive signs, and it's necessary to reinvigorate the economy, and the world must make efforts in this regard. So the cinema world must also look at COVID-19 and see how the film industry should move forward. We must seriously consider this at this time. There will be various discussions about contents today. That is a very important issue for us to deal with. And also, during lunch, before coming here, there was a talk about the various issues about internet distribution. There are many different issues that must be dealt with. But at any rate, for the Tokyo International Film Festival, we would like to work together with MPA, cooperate with them, so that we can create the cinema world of the future. I see that many wonderful speakers are scheduled to give presentations, and many in-depth discussions are scheduled to take place. So we hope that this will indeed prove to be a fruitful seminar. And although this has been a brief speech on my part, unlike Chairman Rivkin, I would like to express also hopes of success of this seminar. Thank you.
Mr. Ando, thank you very much. We would now like to receive speeches from guests. First of all, we received a message from Mr. Akira Amari, member of the House of Representatives and former Minister of Economic revitalization. He has been supporting the contents industry, including by establishing IP Strategy Research Committee within his political party LDP. Let me read out his message on his behalf. I would like to extend my heartfelt congratulations on the successful opening of the 34th Tokyo International Film Festival with the participation of many people despite the impact of the COVID-19 infection. I am confident that the 11th seminar hosted by MPA, a leader in the global film and video industry, focusing on online anti-piracy as allied event of the TIFF, will be very meaningful for the Japanese content industry as it's expanding globally. The improvement of communication environment, the spread of smartphones and other devices, coupled with the expansion of stay-home demand during the pandemic, make films and other contents more accessible, and we can now enjoy them anytime on the internet. In conjunction with these changes in the environment, copyright infringement of movies has become an issue. Recently, it was reported that a fast movie operator was arrested thanks to the efforts of people in the film and video industry. This is indeed the result of quick response of all concerned. On the other hand, the damage caused by pirated sites on the internet is still serious. Thanks to the efforts of all concerned, the regulation of leech sites was enforced in October last year, and illegalization of downloading was enforced in January this year. Thus, measures against piracy in Japan have made great progress. But damage caused by piracy sites hosted abroad does not show a sign of abatement. In order to shut down these pirate sites, it is important to take legal action by bringing the operators into custody in criminal proceedings and claiming compensation for damages in civil proceedings. For this reason, this fiscal year, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry embarked on identification of the operators of pirated sites with cooperation of white hackers by commissioning this project to CODA, the Contents Overseas Distribution Association. So in tandem with these various measures, the government will carefully consider site blocking while monitoring the effects of other measures and the damage situation. In this seminar, lectures will be given by experts on the topics of site blocking legislation and secrecy of communication. It's very important for us to deepen our knowledge through such meetings. We will continue to promote measures to protect rights holders on a government-wide basis, so I ask for your cooperation as well. I would like to conclude my remarks by wishing that this seminar will be meaningful for the content industry, not only in Japan, but also for around the world. The advisor to the International Property Strategy Research Committee of LDP, chairman of Parliamentary Leagues for the Promotion of Content Industry of LDP, Akira Amari.
Next, we are hearing from the Command Center of Intellectual Property Administration in Japan. We have the Secretary General of the Secretariat of Intellectual Property Strategy Headquarters at the Cabinet Office, Secretary General Shigeaki Tanaka. Like last year, I have been invited to speak here, and I would like to express my gratitude. In regard to piracy countermeasures, I'm very grateful to everyone at Motion Pictures Association who have provided enormous cooperation on a daily basis for our country's intellectual property policies. In recent years, with advances in digitalization, the environment surrounding contents has gone through a major change. Through internet distribution services, contents can easily be enjoyed across international borders. Opportunities are now available for Japanese contents to be enjoyed widely by overseas consumers. With the COVID-19 pandemic, things have been severely restricted. But in the contents world, film showings and performances have been severely restricted, and it is difficult to respond to this situation. Meanwhile, if we look at the consumers, because of restrictions in their activities and major changes in their work styles, there's a number of people who are spending more of their free time on the internet to browse contents. This has increased tremendously. This has provided new business opportunities for challengers on the supply side to expand their business by responding to this new demand. But on the other hand, the developments in internet distribution has meant that a situation has emerged whereby copyright infringing contents can cause much damage to the market. On October 2019, the Japanese government announced the menu and process chart for comprehensive measures against piracy over the internet, taking into account the progress made so far. And as Mr. Amari has mentioned, there has been an update on the intellectual property law, and we have solidly carried out various types of changes for the enhancement of access prevention functions and so on. And we have updated and reviewed this recently. What must be implemented solidly are the use of bilateral discussions for international cooperation, the enhancement of international enforcement, and the incorporation of access prevention functions in security software, or the new elements that are incorporated. In response to piracy in cyberspace, which is borderless, it is especially important to have international cooperation and enforcement, as damage caused by a manga piracy site originating in Vietnam is increasing. Japanese publishers, telecommunication operators, and so on have cooperated to establish ABJ, an anti-piracy group, and other private sector efforts have been made so that both public and private sectors are making efforts. In addition to efforts made to the embassy here in Japan, the Commissioner of National Public Security has made a request for cooperation to the Vietnamese Minister of Public Security, and I understand of investigation is currently underway in that country. In this way, to quickly expose piracy, it is important to gather the necessary information to identify the operators of the piracy sites, so the government is cooperating with CODA, the Contents Overseas Distribution Association, in an effort to make a digital forensic investigation using white hat hackers. Meanwhile, piracy measures require private sector efforts, especially in contents industries such as publishing and visual arts, and cooperation among different sectors such as content, telecommunications, software, and internet service industries is essential for comprehensive and innovative efforts to be made. Especially important are cooperation in sharing information about piracy sites, filtering services, security services, search services, and the use of official version marks, wider dissemination of piracy measures, and education. The government will continue to support efforts to enhance cooperation within the private sector. We would like to request the continued understanding and cooperation in this by the Motion Pictures Association. The theme of today's seminar, I understand, is site blocking. And as already explained, this is part of the comprehensive measures and efforts that have been looked at. And as has been explained, the policy, under the policy that the measure will be carried out, that will be implemented with speed, we will be cooperating with relevant agencies and ministries to take measures against piracy. Once again, I would like to express my gratitude to the enormous efforts made by MPA. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tanaka. Next, we would like to receive a speech from Mr. Steve Lang, the Minister Counselor for Economic and Scientific Affairs at the U.S. Embassy, Tokyo. The embassy has been supporting this seminar. Mr. Lang, please.
It's my pleasure to participate in this annual event. Thank you to the organizers and to all the distinguished speakers and presenters for this opportunity to discuss our common interests, protecting intellectual property rights. Excuse me, I might go ahead and take this off. Sorry. U.S. Embassy Tokyo has worked productively with the Motion Picture Association and the government of Japan and many other stakeholders to protect intellectual property rights and to advance protection and enforcement for many years. This remains a top priority for the Biden-Harris administration. As all of us are well aware, copyright and trademark counterfeiting of trademark goods and copyright piracy can result in widespread damage to economies, companies, and consumers. The list of damages is long. Counterfeiting and piracy undermine innovation, entrepreneurship, and creativity. They threaten legitimate jobs, reduce fiscal revenues, and harm reputations. They lead to financial losses for rights holders, and most importantly, they put consumers at risk, threatening their finances, the security of their computer networks, their health, and their safety. A 2021 report by the OECD and the EU Intellectual Property Office estimated that counterfeited and pirated goods accounted for 2.5% of global trade in 2019, or about $464 billion. During the past year, those engaged in trademark counterfeiting and copyright piracy have aggressively taken advantage of a global pandemic, preying on vulnerable communities and putting healthcare workers and the public at risk. With many people spending more time at home to minimize social interaction, we have seen an increase in unauthorized streaming services providing access to extensive collections of pirated content. These services build massive businesses by charging for television, music, movies, and games that they did not create and that they are not authorized to distribute or share. In many instances, these services profit further by distributing malicious code and compromising home computer network systems. Counterfeiting and piracy enterprises undermine legitimate business, ignore labor laws, and disregard safety regulations. They don't pay taxes, and they financially reward criminals. We can work together to find ways to improve IP protection and enforcement systems to protect our businesses and consumers from these threats. A creative economy attracts investment, which produces economic and social benefits for the community. Creative companies and people go where their rights are protected. Conversely, they leave places where IP can be easily stolen through piracy or counterfeiting. Facing these realities, we must work together to pursue measures to minimize illegitimate access to content, while at the same time promoting the innovation that will create and nurture new businesses. On behalf of the US government, I would like to reaffirm our commitment to this important policy agenda and to applaud the efforts of everyone attending today to put these ideas into action. Thank you to the Motion Picture Association and to Uni Japan for providing this valuable forum to consider the difficult issues that are facing our country's entertainment industries. I'm confident that today's discussion will be a valuable and productive one. Thank you very much.
蘭講師
Thank you very much, Minister Councillor Lang. Next, we would like to move on to the keynote, and please give us some time to prepare the stage. And you can still continue to enjoy coffee at the lobby. Thank you.
お声掛けいたします。はい。もうあそこ。はい。でクリッカーが置いてあるのでクリッカーでカチカチとやらせて。それではただいまより。
Now we would like to begin the presentation. First of all, from the University of Electro-Communications, we have Associate Professor Eriko Watanabe. Associate Professor Watanabe, please, the floor is yours. My name is Eriko Watanabe of the University of Electrocommunications, and I'd like to look at the analysis of piracy sites here in Japan and its analysis. We were requested by MPA, and PSS, the Photonic System Solutions, has carried out this investigation under the supervision of myself, Watanabe. First of all, when it comes to the piracy sites, I would like to give you the trends. This is indicated here. And the period that was covered was June 30th of 2021 to September 30th of 2021. And there was a 3-year period of 2017 until September of 2021 where there was surveys made, and we have looked at streaming sites and P2p sites and so on that were subject to the investigation. And in regard to the methodology, this shows what steps we're taking. And we extracted the site of piracy sites and carried out we had 7 different methods used, including FREX. And in regard to focus down on the sites, I'll be explaining about this. And we have gathered the basic data, and we have done directly, and we have looked at the major site situation and so on. And then in regard to the data, we have looked at from July of 2018. There has been various types of accesses that have been made, and so we've looked at the monthly visits, the type of devices that were used, and a study was carried out. And we looked at piracy sites, and through Netcraft, we did an investigation of the servers that were used. And based on this, we looked at the quantification of the situation of piracy sites. And when it comes to the contents and what we were looking at, as indicated here, we have looked at film, TV, anime, and manga. And we have excluded music from our investigation. And then when it comes to the type of piracy sites, as indicated here, there are 5 different types. Leech sites, and they don't have contents. They just simply introduce piracy sites. Next, there's the P2p sites. As you know, for downloading, they have provided the means. Meanwhile, there's the online reading sites where it is possible to browse manga on the sites. There's the streaming sites where video contents allow you to replay. And then storage sites are where there's various online storage that is offered. And as for the sites and how we selected the sites that we investigated, no laser pointer? Okay, I understand. There are 7 different ways that we use to extract the piracy sites. And it's written in blue here. There's the databases and past reports, Lumen database and Google, and Mongo site lists and Google searches were carried out. And there were 3,107 sites. From them, first of all, we looked at adult, music, and game, and others were excluded. When they did not infringe on copyrights, then we excluded them. And also we've excluded UGC sites. And furthermore, for the second step, we went through exclusion, and then we looked at the July 2020 to July of 2021, and we just looked at the sites that had over 100,000 visits per month, and it was 867 sites. The 867, we did an investigation last year as well, and for this year, there was 136 sites that were newly added. And I mentioned about the 867 sites that were extracted. And in regard to the extraction, this graph shows the situation. The horizontal axis looks at the top sites. We looked at the top 10 sites or the top 100 sites. And for the top 10 sites, it was 63% rate of access. And for the 63% that was represented here. And when it comes to accesses that are focused on certain sites, and if you look at 100 sites, then it's over 90 sites, 90%. And so we have looked at the total of 867 that takes care of looking at 99% of the total number of accesses made. And for compared to 2020, if you look at this, you can see that in the red, you are seeing greater amount of online reading sites. And if you look at the top 10 sites, they represent 40% in the 2020 investigation, but it has now become 63% in 2021. So this means that there's concentration into specific sites. And over here, you see that for the top 100 sites, the server information that has been looked at. And for the piracy sites, the top domain sites and the data sites have been looked at. They're mainly divided, but here we have looked at the top domain sites only as the subject. And we've looked at Netcraft to do the investigation. And when we did this, and we looked at the IP address, the hosting company, NetBlock company, and so on. But it is not possible to identify the hosting company. And so therefore, in the graph here, we have the NetBlock corner. The main IP address management companies are looked at. And you can look at this pie chart, and you can see for 2021. And you can also see the 2019 results. And over 50% is CDN operator Cloudflare that represents the majority in both cases. And for 2019 to 2021, the percentage represented by Cloudflare has increased from 53% to 59%. Cloudflare has the involvement of a major trading company in Japan, and so therefore it will be necessary to have more improvements in this area in regard to piracy sites. And we have not looked at other types of sites, but when it comes to piracy sites, there is the NetBlock site where Cloudflare is used, and there's 47 different types. So the structure of these sites are very complicated. And this is the 867 piracy sites and the breakdown of those sites. And out of them, the streaming sites represented the majority, then host, leech, P2p, and then online reading. And for the 867 sites, the active sites, there was 55%. At the time of the investigation, there were those that were closed or could not be accessed due to error, represented 43%. And there was 2% that redirected to other sites. And so therefore, you can see that the piracy sites are crossing over many different domains. And now, in looking at the details of the 867 sites, here's the type breakdown of the content types. And on the left-hand side, you see the 21%. And you can see that there's 25% represented here. And you can see the increase from the previous study. There's also an increase in manga, and a slight increase for television, and for anime there was hardly any increase at all. And there was cases where the certain sites could not be identified. There were certain sites that required user authentication, in which case they were treated as unidentified. Next, looking into the 867 sites that were identified as piracy sites, we've looked at the site type and the contents type. For P2p at the top, followed by streaming, and then film, anime, and television are common. And then next is online reading. These are all manga-related sites. As for leech sites, they involve film, anime, manga, and television. And for hosts, there's many that are unidentified. Over here, the situation of piracy sites in Japan. The total monthly visits are looked at, and you can see that we have the time accessed horizontally and vertically is the number of accesses per month. And as you can see, up until July of 2018 to July of 2020, it had been about 291 million visits per month, or approximately 300 million. That's quite a large number. But at the center, from 2019 July, you can see the revival of some sites, and so therefore a slight increase is observed. But then from July of 2020, there has been a rapid increase, and in July of 2021, it has come to 594 million accesses. So it's approximately 2 times increase. And in regard to the COVID-19, there were recommendations to refrain from going out, and the number of users of piracy sites have increased, and this trend still continues. The major factors are because of the usage of online reading sites, and by site types, the number of monthly accesses are looked at, and this is P2p and streaming and online reading and lead sites and hosting, and for each, the number of monthly visits are shown in the graph, and we have the time access horizontally and vertically. We see the number of visits. And for P2P and streaming and leech, it's flat. But for Hoshino Nomi, there is the revival of the manga reading site, and this was peaked in August of 2019. There was a decrease, but then since June of 2020, the number of piracy sites have increased, and this trend has become more notable this time. And for online reading, we are seeing more than 300 million visits per month. And this is by device. The total number of visits in up until November of 2020, and it was mainly desktop, but then from 2021, the mobile devices increased the number of visits made, and as indicated, this is because of the online reading sites are mainly being accessed by mobile devices, and with mobile, it has turned to 360 million visits per month. So you can see that over a period of 1 year, 3 times increase has been used. And you can see that the very high percentage of accesses made by mobile devices on online reading sites. And in regard to these results, we've looked at the total number of visits over the past 4 years. And we're looking at not the report of 2021, but rather the report of 2020, which was started from July of 2017. And for these piracy sites like Mangamura or YouTube or so on, March of 2018 had a peak with 400 million visits. But now, for Mangamura peak, 400 million at 2018, but now it has come to 600 million. So it's at its worst situation, as you can see from this graph, compared even to the peaks of the past. Now, for the official sites, the number of visits and the piracy site visits have been analyzed. And when it comes to the piracy sites, as well as the legitimate sites to be compared here in Japan, we looked at the top 20 sites that are visited for legitimate, and this is for anime, video, film, television, and so on. And then we have looked at the situation of June of 2021, and we have looked at the top 20 sites. And for manga, we have these 10 comic and comic shinwa and so on. For video, we have Ameba, and a total of 10 sites. And as you can see, for Amazon, that's not included because it was difficult to distinguish between the shopping sites and those that are non-shopping. So we have excluded Amazon. And for the legitimate sites and the piracy sites, this is the number of visits. And when it comes to the legitimate sites, we're seeing gradual increase, but the piracy sites likewise is seeing a rapid increase. And if we looked at the top 20 sites, we can see that for the legitimate sites and the piracy sites, this is the kind of situation and trend that we are seeing. And for the video and manga, if we divide them, then there are very interesting results. So here is the result. This is for video, legitimate sites, and the piracy sites, and how the number of visits change. And as you can see on the right-hand side, we have the time access horizontally and vertically. We have the number of visits, and we have the piracy sites in red, and the legitimate sites are in blue. And as you can see, in the terms of the number of visits, you can see that one increases, in which case the piracy film sites decrease. And we have if we see that a positive spiral has been achieved. Now this is the number of changes between the manga official sites and the piracy sites. And there had been an increase in the piracy sites until 2018, but there is also a major increase in the legitimate sites as well. But in August of 2018, there's been an increase in the piracy sites, and there has been stagnancy in the legitimate manga sites. And you can see that the damage is caused by the piracy sites is causing serious damage to the legitimate sites. So this is the conclusions. Now, when we looked at the total number of 867, it's almost 600 million saints. So it is at its worst situation. And for the 2021 investigation, we looked at the piracy sites that had over 100,000 visits per month were 867, which is an increase by 136 compared to the previous survey. And since June of 2020, the increase in number of piracy sites has been much greater than before. And online reading site visits has increased tremendously. And we have looked at the manga and video, and we can see that if the piracy sites have gone down, and we see that the legitimate sites are increasing, so we're seeing the effectiveness of the approach taken. But meanwhile, for manga, since there had been legitimate sites that have been increasing in the number of visitors from 2018, but now we are seeing a very serious situation because of the increase in the visitors to the piracy sites of on-reading sites. Professor Watanabe, thank you very much. That's quite a shocking result that was presented. Thank you.
The next speaker is Professor Graham Austin, Professor of Law at Melbourne University, Chair of Private Law of Victoria University of Wellington, and Barrister at High Court of New Zealand. Professor Austin is joining us online today. Professor Austin, can you hear me? Then, without further ado, please start your presentation.
You are, as I should say, here in Wellington, where it's evening, konbanwa. So I'm coming to you from Wellington, New Zealand, where you can probably see behind me outside my window is the New Zealand Parliament. So Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, is looking down at us as we discuss the important topic of blocking orders. So first, I'd like to thank the organisers of this wonderful event. I am truly honoured to have been invited to address you on the topic of blocking orders, focusing on the Australian experience. Now, in essence, to use the Australian language, a blocking order is an injunction granted by the court at the request of a copyright owner to block access to a foreign website whose principal purpose or principal effect is to infringe copyright. Now, blocking citizens' access to a website is a serious matter. In free and democratic societies, it must be done for very good reasons. And quite appropriately, before enacting the legislation, the Australian Parliament was concerned with whether giving Australian judges this power was a breach of Australia's human rights commitments, including the right to freedom of expression and the right to a fair hearing. Now, in the 30 minutes that I've been given this afternoon, I shall focus on the analysis that supported the Australian Parliament's conclusion that blocking orders are a proportionate response to the serious social and economic problem of copyright piracy. Next slide, please. My remarks are going to be organised as follows. First of all, I want to talk about the copyright bargain in the age of rights. And here I suggest that modern copyright law must indeed take account of fundamental rights and freedoms. Next, I'll provide a very brief overview of the Australian blocking order regime. And then I'll turn to the most important part of the presentation, the parliamentary analysis of human rights consistency, focusing on the right to freedom of expression, the right to a fair hearing, and the right to privacy. Now, the right to privacy was not discussed by the Australian legislature directly. So here I shall offer my own analysis of why blocking orders do not infringe the right to privacy. And I suggest that compared with other responses to large-scale copyright infringement, blocking orders are probably the most privacy protective of the available alternatives. The next topic will be authors' human rights. This is a topic that, in my view, does not get enough attention in the debate over blocking orders, and that's the human rights protections for authors themselves. From the beginning of the mid-20th century human rights movement, there has been a commitment to protecting, as a human rights matter, authors' moral and material interests in their works of authorship. So most of the human rights discussion focused on blocking orders asks whether blocking orders infringe human rights. But this discussion overlooks the possibility that providing authors with effective remedies against infringement could be required by the human rights protections of authors. And then I briefly conclude. Next slide, please. So to anticipate the conclusion of this talk, the Australian experience suggests that a blocking order system can coexist with human rights commitments. Next slide. What does the copyright bargain look like in the age of rights? Now, back in 2009, the High Court of Australia, Australia's highest court, commented that the social contract envisaged by the first Copyright Act in the common law world, the Statute of Anne, was that an author could obtain a monopoly, limited in time, in return for making a new work available to the public. It's a straightforward quid pro quo in exchange for the effort and the investment that go into creating, publishing, distributing and communicating works of authorship, books, songs, movies, and so on. Society responds by granting a limited monopoly, a monopoly we call copyright. Next slide, please. But nowadays, we recognise that the legal and normative framework that underlies copyright is more complicated. So I suggest that rigorous thinking about copyright requires us to consider the impact of copyright law on other rights. For example, the right to freedom of expression, the right to access information, education rights, the rights of disabled people, the rights of Indigenous peoples. Next slide. And remedial innovations, such as blocking orders, also engage the right to a fair hearing, the right to conduct a business, that's particularly important in the European context, and the right to privacy. Slide 7, next slide. Opponents of blocking orders are therefore quite correct when they say that the legal power to grant these injunctions puts human rights at stake. But I suggest what is not correct is the idea that honouring these rights precludes or prevents the adoption of a blocking order regime. And that reflects the Australian experience. The Australian experience with blocking orders shows us that a blocking order system can coexist with that nation's human rights commitments. Next slide. Very briefly, I want to give an overview of the Australian blocking order regime. Since the passage of the Copyright Amendment Online Infringement Act 2015, copyright owners can now apply to an Australian court for an injunction requiring an internet service provider, or ISP, to take the steps that the court considers reasonable to disable subscribers' access to an offshore website. Okay, this is important in the Australian context. The website needs to be one whose primary purpose, or following further statutory amendments in 2018, primary effect is to facilitate the infringement of copyright. Next slide. Now, the applicant must be a party whose own copyrights are being infringed, but the applicant doesn't need to own all or even most of the infringing works available at the website. So in theory, a successful application for a blocking order benefits all other copyright owners whose works are being infringed. In practice, however, the Australian experience shows that major content providers coordinate blocking order applications. Now, courts take account of the overall characteristics of the online location. So blocking injunctions in the Australian context can thus best be understood as part of the copyright ecology, or ecosystem, as Mr. Rifkin referred to it earlier this afternoon. They are a tool, one of many, that helps sustain functioning markets for creative content. Now, the blocking order regime does not require copyright owners to establish that an ISP is at fault in any way. So this is key. The Australian blocking order regime shifts the analysis of fault to the activities of the offshore websites that facilitate copyright infringements. And so far, all applications for blocking orders in Australia have been successful, and ISPs do not actively defend the applications. They simply abide by the decisions of the court. Now importantly, the blocking order provisions in the Australian Copyright Act are very complicated. They're very detailed. And I think this is also key because the Australian Parliament did not hand courts an open-ended power. And we can see this if we look at the next slide, please. So the revised explanatory memorandum that accompanied the legislation described the provisions as deliberately prescriptive and intended as a precise response to a specific concern raised by copyright owners. The regime was designed to allow a specific and targeted remedy to prevent those online infringements which flagrantly disregard the rights of copyright owners from facilitating access to copyright content. Slide 11. Next slide. The statute includes a long list of factors for the court to consider them, and I've summarised them on this slide. Now, I just want you to get a sense of just how careful and detailed the drafting is in the Australian provisions. So just an outline, and very quickly, because we have limited time, what are courts asked to take into account? The flagrancy of the infringement or the facilitation of the infringement, whether there are directories at the site, whether the owner of the site demonstrates a disregard for copyright generally, whether a foreign court has attempted to disable that site. Whether disabling access is a proportionate response in the circumstances. The impact on any person or class of person likely to be affected by that injunction. Whether it is in the public interest to disable access, and so on. I won't go through them all, but the drafting reflects the modern, more complex version of the social contract that underlies copyright law. We don't hand judges broad powers. We think about the public interest and how that affects what judges can do. Next slide, please. So the legislative framework in Australia makes it clear, and this is parliamentary language, that only online locations that are deliberately and flagrantly infringing copyright will be captured. And the Parliament made plain that the injunction power is not intended to capture incidental infringement. And so the concern about overblocking was there from the beginning. And the way the legislation is structured is designed to avoid that. Next slide, please. Now I want to turn to parliamentary consideration of consistency with human rights norms. And just a bit of background, the Australian Federal Constitution does not include a federal Bill of Rights, but it doesn't mean that federal legislation is not scrutinised for compliance with human rights norms. There is a piece of legislation, the Human Rights Parliamentary Scrutiny Act, which establishes the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights. And it scrutinises bills before the Australian Parliament for consistency with the human rights instruments to which Australia is a party. Next slide. And here are the international human rights instruments. So legislation is scrutinised for consistency with these instruments. I won't read out the titles on the list, but the first two are the most important, and they will be the most familiar to you. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the accompanying Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So legislation is scrutinised against these international human rights instruments. Next slide, please. So in its scrutiny of the blocking order legislation, the Parliamentary Committee focused principally on two rights. First, the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and second, the right to fair hearing. And this was engaged because the operators of the pirate websites might not be parties to the litigation. Next slide. As the committee noted, most rights are not absolute, but can be limited if the limitations meet certain standards. Limitations must be prescribed by law and in pursuit of a legitimate objective, be rationally connected to that objective, and be a proportionate way to achieve that objective. Here, the objective, of course, is to stop copyright piracy, or at least prevent Australians being able to access pirate sites. Next slide. The committee accepted that reducing online copyright infringement was indeed a legitimate objective, and that blocking orders were rationally connected to that goal. Next slide. But the committee wanted more information about whether the blocking order regime was a proportionate way to achieve that end. So it sought the advice of the Australian Attorney General as to whether the blocking order regime was a proportionate response to copyright infringement, taking account of the right to freedom of expression and the right to a fair hearing. Next slide. Based on that correspondence and the committee's further analysis, the committee concluded that the blocking order measures were indeed a proportionate response to the problem of online copyright infringement when compared with other available measures. Next slide. I'll return to the committee's substantive analysis of the human rights issues in a moment. But I thought it would be useful to pause here and note the many layers of scrutiny of human rights concerns that the blocking order regime received during the Australian parliamentary process. So, we have analysis of human rights compliance in the bill's explanatory memorandum, so the memorandum accompanying the bill. There were submissions from various groups drawing attention to human rights issues. There was, as I mentioned a moment ago, scrutiny by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights. Then there was analysis by the Australian Attorney-General in the light of the Joint Committee's questions. And then there was further analysis by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights following the Attorney-General's response. So this was not a casual analysis of the human rights issues. This was very thorough. Next slide, please. So I want now to turn to the detail of the analysis of the relationship between blocking orders and fundamental human rights. First, the right to freedom of expression. As to the proportionality of the response, the key steps in the analysis of the committee can be synthesized as follows. First, yes, there are alternative measures to blocking orders, such as education and industry codes and so on. But these are complements to blocking orders, but they are not substitutes for measures that would disrupt the supply of infringing content like blocking orders. Disrupting that supply of infringing content steers consumers towards legitimate sources of content, and initiating direct proceedings against individual infringers, the Parliament said, is just not an effective way of addressing online infringement of this scale. And importantly, for the right to freedom of expression, blocking orders do not limit access to ideas, other than in cases where doing so would infringe another's copyright. That's all they do. Next slide, please. The Parliament pointed out that courts are going to be given the power to tailor injunctions to specific pages or indexes where a site includes both legitimate and infringing material, and that the injunction power is just not intended to capture incidental infringement. It pointed out that it's just impractical for copyright owners to bring infringement actions against foreign-based online locations due to complexities of private international law or conflict of laws and the costs associated with initiating foreign litigation. And finally, and importantly, when deciding whether to make a blocking order, a federal court will weigh up a number of factors before granting an injunction. Next slide. So against that analytical background, the committee accepted that the blocking order regime is likely to be compatible with the right to freedom of expression. That was its conclusion, and so the legislation could go ahead through the parliamentary process. Next slide. Very briefly, the right to a fair hearing. Now, remember, this right was implicated because the operators of the offshore website would not necessarily be parties to the litigation. But as the Attorney General and the committee noted, there may be circumstances where the operator of the online location simply cannot be located. And if a fair hearing, if a right to a fair hearing meant that a blocking order could not be granted in such circumstances, then copyright owners would be left with no meaningful relief. And again, the committee concluded that the blocking order regime was a proportionate response in light of this minor intrusion on the right to a fair hearing. Next slide, please. Now, the right to privacy. The Australian parliamentary scrutiny of the blocking order regime really did not engage with privacy rights. But, of course, the right to privacy is recognised in the international human rights instruments to which international instruments to which Australia is a party and against which new Australian legislation is scrutinised. So Article 17 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights protects, in familiar language, arbitrary or unlawful interferences with an individual's privacy, family, correspondence, or home. Next slide. In another context, the Joint Committee on Human Rights has said that if the government mandates the use of technology in a manner that does limit a person's right to privacy, the approach that the government takes must be the least restrictive method to achieve the relevant governmental purpose, and there must be appropriate safeguards. Accordingly, like the right to freedom of expression, the right to privacy is not absolute. And using this approach, I think we get a fuller picture of the implications of blocking orders for the right to privacy if we compare blocking orders with other ways of protecting copyrights against massive online infringement. Next slide. So let's compare blocking orders with, first, direct obligations imposed on ISPs to monitor for infringing content. I mean, obviously, there is a tension here with principles of international copyright law that were being established at the end of the last century. Mere provision of internet connectivity without more does not give rise to an obligation to monitor for infringing content, at least in most parts of the world. So the absence of a legal obligation to monitor for infringing content lowers operating costs, but it also protects subscribers' privacy. Next slide, slide 28. So the blocking order system directs attention to content, not people. And I think this is very important. I'm just going to check that we're on the right slide. Yes, the focus of the activity is the availability of the content, not the activities of the ISP's subscribers. That triggers application for an order that the website be blocked. So nothing in the Australian legislation requires anyone to see which individual users were trying to access the targeted website. It permits just the deployment of technical solutions that direct all subscribers from the sources of the infringing material. And as an Australian court has pointed out, incidentally, in a case that involved anime, the flagrancy of the infringement can be tested by test downloads or streams. There's just no need to target subscribers' own use of the target websites. Next slide. Now, another option would be direct civil actions against infringements. But if an individual subscriber was served with legal proceedings or, where permitted, received a demand letter, they would immediately know that their internet browsing and download habits were being monitored. I mean, again, not especially privacy protective. Next slide, please. Third alternative, let's test this against three strikes regimes. Now, I speak from experience here because I had the pleasure for a year or so to serve on the New Zealand Copyright Tribunal, and we were applying the three strikes regime. It's a low stakes, low cost regime, but it's premised on identifying the individual infringers. And as a tribunal member, I received quite a lot of information about the browsing habits of subscribers and also their family members. So information about the personal use of downloading services is front and center in that process. So once again, blocking orders can be made and put into effect without accessing any information about individuals' online activity. The right to privacy is just not engaged at all. Next slide, please. Okay, the final substantive topic, before I conclude my remarks, is the topic of authors' human rights and the efficacy of blocking orders. Right at the beginning of the post-World War II human rights movement, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights announced, everyone has the right to the protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which he is the author. And this statement is reaffirmed in Article 15(1)(c) of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which is a binding instrument. Next slide. So authors' material interests, which are protected as a human rights matter, include the right to earn a living from one's intellectual property from a paying audience, assuming that the author can find one. And the emerging jurisprudence indicates that authors' human rights protection and copyright law align in key respects, even if they are not identical. Next slide. Now, the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has said that this right, the right of authors, seeks to encourage the active contribution of creators to the arts and science and to the progress of society as a whole. It's intrinsically linked to other rights, including the right to take part in cultural life, the right to enjoy the benefits of science, the opportunity to gain one's living by work which one freely chooses, and the right to adequate remuneration. And what this does, I suggest, is that it enhances the dignity of creative workers. And my hometown is Wellington, New Zealand, even though I'm also a professor in Australia. And many of you will know that Wellington has become a magnet for creative people. And partly this is because of filmmakers such as Peter Jackson and Richard Taylor. But there's extraordinary vibrancy in this town out there in CGI, innovation, gaming, and so on. You can't compete with Japan, but for a small place, we're doing well. Now, these copyright industries give creative people the opportunity to work, to realize their potential, I would say to flourish as human beings, to lead dignified lives. Next slide, please. The human rights of authors are linked to the right to own property and the right to freedom of expression, including the right to seek, receive and impart information of all kinds, and the right to the full development of the human personality. I mean, note the connection here between authors' rights and the right to freedom of expression. Sure, copyright protections restrict others' speech, those who would use others' creativity to their own ends, but it also encourages the production of new expression, the very expression that the right to freedom of expression protects. So if we're serious about freedom of expression, we need to take seriously both aspects of the freedom of expression right. Next slide. The international jurisprudence on authors' human rights suggests that all of this requires those rights to be effectively protected. So critics who emphasize only how protecting copyright detracts from fundamental rights, such as the right to freedom of expression, tell only half the story. Next slide, please. So this, returning to the Australian context, this emerging international jurisprudence on the human rights of authors formed part of the legal and normative background to the discussion in the Australian Parliament of blocking orders. So in the explanatory memorandum accompanying the 2018 amendments, it was said, the proposed amendments would promote the right to benefit from the protection of the moral and material interests in a production by strengthening the protection provided to authors in enforcing their copyright. In many cases, copyright infringement results in lost sales for creators and their licensees, detracting from the protection of the material interests that result from their literary and artistic production. This is all language taken from Article 15(1)(c) of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Next slide, please. So I think we can look at the effectiveness of blocking orders through two lenses. First, the efficacy of blocking orders is conventionally linked to the proportionality question. So the evidence suggesting that blocking orders do significantly reduce copyright piracy supports the conclusion reached in the Australian legislative context that blocking orders are a proportionate response to the problem of copyright piracy, taking into account the human rights commitments that Australia has made. Next slide, please. In addition, the effectiveness of blocking orders to reduce and inhibit copyright infringement is relevant to authors' human rights. The United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has said that legal protections need to be effective in securing for authors the moral and material interests resulting from their productions. This suggests that to allow massive infringement of copyright to continue unchecked is, to say the very least, in tension with this guidance about what is required by our commitment to authors' human rights. Next slide, please. So, two very brief points to conclude. First, the Australian experience suggests that blocking orders are a proportionate response to a serious social and economic problem. And that conclusion is reinforced and justified by the legislative design and the emerging practice under the Australian scheme. So proportionality is reinforced by the characteristics of the scheme. Blocking orders are a limited judicial power to grant an injunction. The importance of the public interest, the public interest in not having sites blocked unnecessarily or inappropriately, is reflected, embodied, I would say, in the detailed statutory factors that courts in Australia consider. And the Australian experience suggests that the regime is really only used in serious cases. So next slide, please. So pulling all of these points together, we can see 2 points. First, fundamental rights are not impermissibly limited by Australia's site blocking regime. Secondly, the growing recognition of authors' own human rights, acknowledged in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and reinforced by the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, offers further support to that conclusion. Next slide. So thank you for your time, and again for the honour of the invitation to address you today.
オースティン教授、大変どうもありがとうございました。
We would like to thank you, Professor Austin, and Professor Austin will be joining us for the panel discussion as well.
The next speaker is Professor Nobuharu Obinata, Dean and Professor of the Faculty of Law of Kumamoto University. Professor Obinata, I hand over to you. My name is Nobuharu Obinata, and my area of specialty is constitutional law. I work at the Kumamoto University. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak at the MPA seminar again this year. Since the time is limited, let me start the presentation without further ado. Last year at this MPA seminar, I spoke on the theme of constitutionality of blocking of pirated sites. Since around that time, the government of Japan has accelerated its measures against piracy, for example, by amending the Copyright Act to make it illegal to download pirated copies, and by amending the Provider Liability Limitation Act to make it easier to identify website operators in the event of a lawsuit, which will come into effect soon. However, as you are aware, pirated sites are still infesting the internet. In particular, the amount of economic damage seems to be on the rise due to stay-home demand during the pandemic. Under these circumstances, and with the government's release of emergency measures against internet privacy sites and how to proceed with measures against internet policy in 2018, so these documents were published by the government. As a result, the rights holders have been calling for the implementation of site blocking as a last resort in combating internet piracy. However, site blocking has been strongly criticized by leading constitutional scholars and information law scholars on the ground that it infringes upon the freedom of expression on the internet and the secrecy of communication. I believe that my talk last year comprehensively covered the essence of the constitutional issues related to site blocking. But my point was, from constitutional theoretical point of view, if site blocking does not infringe on freedom of expression on the internet, one can judge whether blocking restricts the secrecy of communication by weighing the benefits to be gained against the benefits to be lost by blocking. In short, my talk focused on the issue of site blocking and freedom of expression on the internet. Later, however, the seminar organizer asked me if I could theoretically explain the relationship between site blocking and privacy, since the secrecy of communication restricted by site blocking seems to be related to privacy. I felt it was an interesting topic, and yet that was missing from my talk last year, so I took the opportunity once again to appear before you this year. So before I close the introduction part of this presentation, there is one thing I would like to confirm with you. That is, the government's 2018 documents, which I mentioned earlier, called for ISPs to block pirate sites as a voluntary measure, albeit with the reservation that it is a temporary and emergency measure until the legal system is developed. The blocking was not based on law, but it is rather administrative guidance. Some of criticism of blocking by constitutional scholars may have been that such blocking without legal base is unconstitutional. But this is not the kind of blocking envisioned in my presentation today. If a law requiring ISPs to block pirated sites were to be enacted in the future, how would the law be evaluated in relation to the protection of the privacy and secrecy of internet users' communications? That is the view for this lecture. I would like to make it clear that this lecture is intended for the case where the law is enacted to implement pirate site blocking. Article 21.2 of the Constitution stipulates in the second sentence that secrecy of communication shall not be violated. The Article 21 guarantees the freedom of expression, but in many foreign constitutions, the secrecy of communication is stipulated in a separate article from the freedom of expression. In Japan, examples of Italy and Germany are often introduced. Also, in the Meiji Constitution, older constitution, the freedom of expression was stipulated in Article 29, and the secrecy of letters, which was widely understood to mean the secrecy of communication, was stipulated separately in Article 26. This is probably because the secrecy of communication is considered to have a different protective legal interest from the freedom of expression, as its main purpose is to protect the freedom of private life in preventing others from knowing the contents of communication with a specific person. However, in the Constitution of Japan, secrecy of communication is placed in the clause that guarantees the freedom of expression. Based on this structure of the article, prevailing understanding about the significance of protecting the secrecy of communication is that communication is part of freedom of expression because communication is a form of expression and a part of the process of communication. But at the same time, the main significance of protecting the secrecy of communication is to protect the freedom and privacy of the private life. This means to be prevailing understanding. Nonetheless, freedom of expression generally aims to protect the external communication process that is directed to unspecified or many people, while the original meaning of secrecy of communication is to enable private contact between individuals through the protection of internal communication process. With this in mind, the view that the purpose of guaranteeing the secrecy of communication is to protect privacy above all, or to protect the private secret sphere of individual is gaining momentum. In any case, both of these views share the point that secrecy of communication is at least intended to protect privacy. Also, the addressee of the Constitution is the state. The Constitution is legal norm that requires state organs to exercise state power in a manner that does not violate the articles and principles of the Constitution. Therefore, Article 21.2, which stipulates the secrecy of communication, also prohibits state organs from violating the secrecy of communication. And this is confirmed at the legal level in Article 3 of the Telecommunications Business Law, which stipulates the communications handled by a telecommunications carrier must not be censored. The word censorship here means, according to the explanation, the state or any other public body forcibly examining certain expressions or the content of the ideas expressed through such expressions. Article 3 of the TBA can be understood as the attempt to realize the protection of the secrecy of communication required by Article 21 of the Constitution by prohibiting the censorship of communications. One can say that Article 21, paragraph 2 of the Constitution, which stipulates the secrecy of communication, requires the state to establish legal system that will prevent communication providers, including the state, from violating the secrecy of communication. This is embodied in Article 4.2 of TBA. And this, the main text says that a person engaged in telecommunication business must not disclose other person's secrets which came into their knowledge while in service with respect to communications handled by the telecommunication carriers. So, regarding this article, according to the commentary I cited earlier, it explains that imposes on those engaged in the telecommunication business the duty to protect the secrecy of communication from the viewpoint of securing the trust of users in telecommunication business. It is generally understood that the subject of secrecy of communication is not only the contents of communication, but also all facts related to communication, in other words, external matters of communication or metadata. The reason for this is that there are cases where privacy is harmed by the knowledge of external matters. By the way, I mentioned earlier that the protection of secrecy of communications is to protect the privacy of the communicating parties. Then, what kind of rights and interests does privacy mean here? There is almost no disagreement in court cases and academic theories that personal privacy deserves protection as one of the personal rights or moral interests under tort law. The Supreme Court has also recognized that Article 13 of the Constitution stipulates the freedom of private life of the people should be protected against the exercise of public power. In constitutional law theories, it is generally accepted that the freedom of private life in this article is the same as the right to privacy. In addition, with the development of information and communication technology, data is collected and utilized in all aspects of social life. And since personal information is included in such data, there are concerns about the risk of privacy infringement associated with the utilization of such data. Thus, the concept of privacy seems to have gained a certain level of recognition in practice and in academic theories, but there seems to be no consensus on what privacy means in the first place. Therefore, in this presentation, I will attempt to summarize the case laws that the Japanese Supreme Court has presented on privacy protection. There are three types of privacy in my view. Privacy in relation to the blocking of pirate sites is the privacy that is protected by the secrecy of communication, which the site blocking allegedly infringe upon. After categorizing privacy, I will talk about which type of privacy is relevant to site blocking later. One of the privacy cases of the first category that Japanese Supreme Court considered is the publication of the facts or information belonging to privacy by private individuals. This was considered to be an act of damaging moral interest that should have been legally protected, thus recognized as a tort. The right to privacy originated in the United States in the late 19th century. As is well known, the 1890 article, The Right to Privacy by Samuel Warren and Louis Brandeis, advocates the right to be left alone in the interest of what would later be called privacy from the sensationalism of yellow journalism. In Japan, too, the 1964 Tokyo District Court decision in the After the Banquet case recognized the right to privacy as an essential right for maintaining individual dignity in a society with advanced mass communication. A precedent that can be categorized in this category is the non-fiction reversal case, which recognized that not having one's criminal record published in a non-fiction work is an interest worthy of legal protection. In addition, in the Niagara River speculative reporting case, where it was questioned whether reporting using pseudonyms was speculative reporting prohibited by Article 61 of the Juvenile Law. The Supreme Court stated that the criminal information and history information contained in this article is information that belongs to privacy that one does not want others to know without permission. The court went on to say that in the case of infringing of privacy, a tort is established if the legal interest is not having the fact published overweighs the reason for publishing it, citing the reversal decision. In this way, the first type of privacy is protected as a moral interest. And the second type of Supreme Court to consider privacy case is one in which privacy is used as a legal concept to protect liberty in private life. This is based on Article 13 of the Constitution. And the right to pursue happiness stipulated in this article, so-called moral interest theory, has been prevailing theory. And this theory reads into the right to pursue happiness, the interests that are indispensable or necessary for an individual to be morally autonomous, and gives it constitutional protection. However, in the information society, it has come to be considered that even information that is not directly related to moral interest, in other words, even extended private information, should not be obtained or used without permission in relation to the state. So even if it is extended private information, if it is collected in large quantities and used extensively, it may threaten the moral autonomy of the individual. Therefore, constitutional law theorists have formulated the concept of the right to privacy as the right to control one's own information by interpreting the constitutionally protected privacy as the right to control one's own information. So in this way, they establish the legal theory that even if information is not directly related to the moral autonomy of the individual as extended private information, the state can only handle it through appropriate means of acquiring, possessing, and using it for legitimate purpose. I think it is possible to understand the concept of privacy as freedom in private life in the Supreme Court's case law is different from the concept of privacy proposed for the purpose of protecting moral interests. Specifically, in the 1969 Kyoto Prefectural Student Self-Governing Association case, where illegality of police photographing a group of people marching in demonstration was questioned, the Grand Bench cited freedom not to be photographed without permission. In the case of 1995 refusal of fingerprinting under the former Alien Registration Act, the court used the phrase freedom from being forced to submit to fingerprinting without consent. So the protected legal interest of liberty in private life, which emerges with the phrase of freedom from something without permission or consent, can be categorized differently from the first category, where concept of privacy is derived from moral value.
The third type of privacy matter taken up by the Supreme Court is slightly different from the first two. The first type deals with matters that are exposed, which normally one would want to keep confidential. The second type is the case when information needlessly collected without one's awareness. Both cases deals with the problem where the subject of the information has information gathered without the subject's consent. The third type deals with when the subject of the information has voluntarily provided information to a handler of that information. Cases such as when an application to participate in a lecture is made or an application to start using services. In both cases, the subject of the information is providing the information on a voluntary basis. In this case, the information is not confidential and the information is not collected unnecessarily. In such instances, there are precedences where the information recipient was deemed to have acted illegally. For example, there was the Waseda University lecture case where a speech was to be made by the Chinese president at the time. And for the purpose of organizing the event and so forth, personal information such as the student number, name, address, and telephone number were presented to the security staff, and the Supreme Court determined that even for personal information that does not require confidentiality, it is natural to think that the individual may not wish for unnecessary disclosure to another party and that such expectations should be protected. The judgment was that the relevant information was privacy information of the plaintiff that is covered by legal protection. Also, in cases where personal information is collected for use of educational texts and systems such as name, gender, date of birth, post number, address, telephone number, guardian's name, and that information was leaked, such as the Benesse case, it was judged that the information about the plaintiff was subject to legal protection as privacy information. Reference was made to the Waseda University case, and due to the fact, it was judged that the leakage of information was an infringement of the plaintiff's privacy. In this manner, the Supreme Court looks at information that does not directly involve the personality interest of the subject of the information when it was provided voluntarily, and has judged that a reasonable expectation of appropriate management is a protected legal right when the relevant expectation or trust is damaged. It constitutes an illegal act. It can be thought that the Supreme Court is looking at this kind of expectation and trust between the information provider and the recipient of the information as being linked to the concept of privacy. Up till now, we have divided into 3 types privacy cases taken up by the Supreme Court. The first type involves personality interests. The second is about privacy as a liberty in private life that forbids the gathering of information without consent. And the third type is about expectations and trust, about the concept of privacy of appropriate management of information provided voluntarily. Looking at these, it would seem that the word primacy would seem to be like a concept with differing legal interests depending on the situation. When it comes to site blocking of piracy sites infringing on the secrecy of communications, because the secrecy of communications protects privacy, which one of the 3 types of privacy would it be there? We would like to look at the type of privacy that may be infringed upon by site blocking. Regarding privacy as a protection for secrecy of communications, it is believed that this involves the content of the communications as well as the constituents of the communication. Therefore, the protection of the secrecy of communications would seem to involve all 3 types of privacy. However, when it is limited to detecting access destination for site blocking, and when considering the protection of secrecy of communication, it is necessary to consider what needs to be protected between the ISP and the user in Internet utilization by protecting the secrecy of communications. There is information necessary for Internet usage by the user that is provided to the ISP to be appropriately managed. Would this not be the essential protection that secrecy of communications be about? The Internet utilization relationship between the ISP and the user is a closed legal relationship, whereby the trust that the ISP appropriately manages and uses the information is absolutely essential to establish communication. So, in this relationship, there is the idea that the reasonable expectation and trust on information management between the ISP and the user warrants legal protection. When what needs to be protected is indicated with the concept of privacy in Internet utilization, I believe it can be said that the privacy here refers to the 3rd type in Japan's Supreme Court precedents. In that regard, please recall the Article 4-2 of the Telecommunications Business Law mentioned at the beginning. The text calls for the need for a telecom operator to protect the secrets of others gained through communications handled by the operator. And in the text, as communication is essential for human social life, it would be subject to Article 21-2 of the Constitution relating to the guarantee of freedom of ideological expression and would relate to the guarantee of freedom of personal privacy of the individual. In other words, the protection of privacy. In Telecommunications Business Law, Article 4-2, there is mention about achieving trust by the user towards the telecommunication business by imposing a fiduciary duty on part of the operator to protect the secrecy of communications. I have introduced this previously. In the article commentary of the Telecommunication Business Law, the position is taken that the significance of protecting the secrecy of communications is to protect the trust of the user towards the telecommunication business. Now, in regard to the conclusions, then, I would like to provide my conclusions. Secrecy of communications protects privacy. The privacy refers to the reasonable expectation on part of the user that the information provided to the operator for the user to utilize communications will be appropriately handled. If the reasonable expectation is not infringed upon, site blocking would not infringe upon secrecy of communications. If the use of information for site blocking does not violate the reasonable expectation of the communication user to the operator, it would not infringe upon the secrecy of communications. For enacting a law on site blocking, the use of information for blocking must not infringe upon reasonable expectation by the communication user towards the operator. In other words, it is felt that a fiduciary duty on part of the operator in handling communication information should be stipulated in the legal system. I prepared my own Q&A. Can constitutional rights, secrecy of communications, privacy be restricted by laws such as the site blocking law? This invokes Article 98-1 of the Constitution regarding the nature of the Constitution as the supreme law. According to Article 98-1, the Constitution is the supreme law and any law that contravenes it would be invalid. As an answer to this one could respond that in the series of acts involving site blocking, there is nothing that is in violation of Article 4-2 of Telecommunications Business Law. I will not go into detail on this, but in the paper by Professor Makoto Ito and Professor Tetsuo Maeda in copyright issue of number 677, published in 2017, the idea that DNS blocking is not a new means to get user information for the purpose of site blocking is introduced, along with an image of DNS blocking. However, even if access destination detection for site blocking does not infringe upon Article 4-2 of the Telecommunication Law, the following response could be made. First of all, privacy is not considered an absolute right that cannot be adjusted. Now, even if access destination detection for site blocking does not infringe upon Article 4-2 of the Telecommunication Law, the following responses could be made. First of all, privacy is not considered an absolute value that cannot be adjusted with other values according to Japanese precedents. In this regard, when the legality of eavesdropping on telephone communication for a criminal case was disputed in 1999 in the communication interception case by the Supreme Court, the decision made this clear. In the Nagaragawa speculative reporting case regarding the infringement of privacy, the interest in not making public the facts and the reasons for making them public were weighed comparatively, and a method was presented for the judgment of an illegal act. Also, several laws have stipulated that the secrecy of communications is a relative value that can be adjusted with other values. By thinking this way, in cases of assumption of this lecture of implementing site blocking by enacting a law, it is believed that the answer to the question number 1 of whether secrecy of communications and privacy can be limited, and the answer would be it can limit the secrecy of communications and privacy. Next, second question would be, how will site blocking law be reviewed for constitutionality as a law that does not infringe upon secrecy of communication and privacy? When a court examines whether an act of the government, in this case, the enactment of a law, violates constitution or not, this is referred to as a constitutional review or judicial examination, and there are standards and frameworks proposed academically about this constitutional review, and if a law clears those standards and frameworks, it is said that the law is not a violation of the Constitution. Then, what are the factors that must be met for a law for site blocking of piracy sites to be considered as being not an infringement of secrecy of communications and of privacy that is protected under the Constitution? Although this is not always comprehensive, I believe that the following factors need to be cleared for this law to be considered in violation of the Constitution. The assumption of this lecture is that, first, site blocking is institutionalized by law and statutes, and second, it is a legislative fact that damages caused by piracy is immense, and that there is a situation whereby there is no effective solution other than site blocking. Thirdly, I believe that it would be required that the target of the site blocking must be limited to sites with malicious pirate versions, almost dead copies. This is an area related to the freedom of expression. Fourth, whether the personal information used for blocking is limited and whether a mechanism is in place that bans the use of the information for any other purpose is an important point. Especially considering the communication over the internet today, it is not just the content of the communication, but also external information, metadata about the communication that needs to be protected. This is important for the protection of trust of the users towards operators. There are other factors, but in the enactment of a law, these are the factors that need to be cleared. As in the case of last year, the talk has been presented with the perspective that implementing site blocking of piracy sites is not necessarily in violation of the Constitution, with the hopes that there will be even further vigorous debate on the pros and cons of site blocking. I would like to close my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Obinata.
続きまして駒沢総合
The next speaker is Mr. Ikuo Takahashi, Attorney at Law of Komazawa Legal Chambers. Takahashi-san, please start. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I am Takahashi. I am Attorney at Law. I would like to talk about site blocking and reasonable expectation of privacy, secrecy of communications in Galapagos Islands. This is the title of my presentation. Now, in the beginning, this is the outline of my presentation today. So I would like to talk about the history of my own engagement on this matter, and also the discussion in 2018. I would like to briefly look back to the debate at that time, and the main issue with regard to IP is whether or not is it foul play to pass the ball toward forward. So what are you talking about? Maybe you want to know, but I would like to use the analogy of the American football. And also, I would like to talk about Japan in the context of the international community. In that case, the intermediary of internet providers are playing more and more important role. Therefore, in the world, we have to clearly define from the historical perspective the roles to be played by internet intermediaries or ISPs. That is my area of concerns. Now, I am since lawyer for the past 30 years or so. I have been working as lawyer. So, in addition to the legal practice, the first law I learned was the telecommunication law the radio law when I was a junior high school student. And during the 19th, we started the internet. And also before that, I was using a personal computer-based communication. However, the Telecommunication Act was a different interpretation from what I learned from radio law. So I set this to ISPs, and they would agree. And I want to learn a security issue, and I want to learn more about the Telecommunication Law Act. So I learned the secrecy of communication later, and it involves constitution. Therefore, I interviewed constitutional scholars and so forth. I conducted a lot of research. So I think we are seeing the very strange destiny of the secrecy of communication. So now, international survey and security-related surveys I have been conducting, and my company, IT Research Art, the main research service involves the international comparative study related to privacy and internal security. Fortunately, in 2010 onward, from MIC, Ministry of Internal Affairs, I have received several commissions. And as a result, information infringing surveys have been conducted to see the various countries' response in this area. And in 2018, the blocking rised. I conducted a survey in 2015. As I studied, I see the emergence of new laws here and there. So I wanted to catch up with the development. And this year, I was given this wonderful opportunity to speak to you in this seminar. Now, in that sense, I am very happy that I am invited to this forum, and this is very interesting topic. So in 2019, site blocking debate, if I focus on this. In the interest of time, I would like to say in a nutshell, on the April 23rd, NTT-related providers, 3 of them, as emergency measures, they wanted to block the sites upon the request of the government. However, it caused a frenzy in the media. There are pros and cons, and many people supported and some are against. So there are positive views and cautious views. And the basis for the positive views, as was introduced by Professor Obinata, secrecy of communication. There is a concern among the public regarding the secrecy of communication. And if we are to using the imminent danger aversion issue, this is like a child pornography law. And some people say that this may not be effective. And also in April, upon the request of the government, providers responded. However, maybe the government trying to circumvent the legal requirements without establishing a law. Some people said, as Mr. Obinata talked about, the secrecy of communication in Article 21-2 of the communication, we cannot violate the secrecy of communications. And as far as the Telecommunication Business Act, the title is only protection of secrecy. There are 2 articles here. And in the Korea, they have 2 clauses in the same article. However, we have a different clauses in this way. So secrecy of communication. So this data is considered as a secrecy of data, communication secrecy of a person, and also communication of secrecy of other persons. So that is a metadata. So in English as well, it is explained. In English, we don't know where communication is related to. Is it the Constitution or Telecommunication Business Act? We can't know right away. So when it comes to communication, perhaps Professor Austin can explain the communication itself. The contents, communication means that the contents, as is often used in the legal terms, generally speaking. Now, this issue, personally, I have the personal view in the following way. This issue, so this is a season of football, American football. It's like a zone defense. So the individuals have different roles to play. So at the center of the different roles, this is a weak point. Vulnerability is there. So if you attack that area, you will win the game. So with regard to site blocking argument, the copyrights and the Constitution and the TBA, they have different zones like this. So the So right in the center of the zones where three laws are not relevant, that is an issue. Then overall structure of the issue. So if you pass the ball forward, is it a penalty? Is it a foul play? Do you think it is a foul play? Or there are people who say this is only a natural course of the game. So basically, among the audience members, Australia and New Zealand, there are some people from those countries. In the case of rugby, this is a slow forward. So it's a foul play. And if you ask this question in the US, this is American football. Exactly, we are in that season. Forward pass is the bright feature of the games. Therefore, it is not at all foul play, according to the US audience. Then, what is it here? Now, what are we discussing in the first place? American football. We say American football. Then could we throw the ball forward? We have a quarterback throwing the ball forward, and we have to define the role to be played by certain players. Then based on that understanding, we can have a fruitful discussion among different parties. So we have to see whether our discussions are meshing well. So interpretation of laws, in the secrecy of communication interpretation. So interpretation of the secrecy of law communication has to be something that fits the contemporary situation. The first point, whether or not we are on the same battlefield. I talked about the cautious passive views, and because application of the aversion of the imminent danger would be evading the legal requirements. And the copyright holders, upon the order of the court, are able to block the sites. So this is the basis of the positive view. From a different perspective, the providers are able to block the sites. In that case, providers have to know exactly the violation of copyright infringement based on the views from the third-party independent views. So in this way, realistically speaking, the infringement was patently recognized, and therefore assets which are used for their business purpose, they will help to block the infringement. Is it illegal or not? So if that is the case in this discussion, we have to ask the question correctly. Well thought out questions necessary, in my view. So the courts or maybe the administrative organ going through the competent measures, administrative guidance or administrative order, in other words. So with the appropriately established procedures, whether or not we can stop illegal distribution of information. So this is the right question to be asked. So in reality, such an independent organization say that the sites has to be blocked. Based on that process, that we are deciding IP providers would decide to facilitate the infringement. So in this way, we have to separate problems or questions, in my view. Then, site blocking, passive views, cautious views. Frankly speaking, such legalistic questions have not been argued in any literature. Some people say that NTT case, even if you think that telegraph is illegal, you have to distribute that to the addressees. So that was the case, and such expression does not appear in the legal literature. So I don't understand what this cautious views are saying. So in these cautious views, we can try to find the rationale. However, we can say that if we allow providers to block the sites, that would cause a too much burden on the providers. And also, the secrecy of communication must be respected in the light of Constitution. So maybe this can be the answer to question point 1 to support the cautious views. However, conversely speaking, in this area, with law, if the court issues the order, then the following the court order is also permissible, of course. So this threatening telegraph case that I mentioned earlier, when you notice this is happening, are you able to stop distribution of such information with your own responsibility? So generally speaking, monitoring can be done. And I think this is a different problem. So that if you have a request from the trustworthy leader, then you are able to block the sites.
裁判所がですね、
Maybe that the courts issue an order, in which case there may be guidelines of secrecy of communications, but there may be legitimate freedoms involved. That's only natural. But in such a case, between the Constitution and the court order, what is the relationship would be the question. Now, for the communication operator, does the Constitution truly apply to them? It's not clear. Now, when it came to the days when it was a monopoly, the Constitution applied. But then, since privatization, what about the application of the Constitution to private corporations? It may sound good, but then, for protection of human rights, it may be a negative factor. And that's a personal thought, but that doesn't matter. Within the Ministry of Internal Communications and Internal Affairs and Communications, there is a study group, and the direct involvement is often reported about this. But at any rate, in 2019, there was the Tokyo High Court decision about this, and it seems that there is a direct application of the Constitution onto telecommunication operators. But then in regard to how to pursue this, there was the report from Australia, and it relates to that. At the very bottom, you can see there is the 2014 EU court decision. It's very important. And for basic human rights, it's the EU court, so they looked at the courts of Europe and what is recognized there. And if anything is in violation of that, then a court cannot reach such a decision. And so therefore, when it comes to copyrights, for the operators, if an ambiguous order is issued, then there may be sanctions or penalties imposed, which may put the provider on a very tough spot. That's indeed the case. And so it's necessary, it must be minimal, it must follow proportionality, and all those points on behalf of the operator must be taken into consideration. And also in regard to internet access rights by site blocking, to what degree are the rights going to be infringed upon? So the idea is that in the EU, the courts looked at this, and from that standpoint, it is necessary to study this matter. And that is the way the discussions on this subject should be organized. But when we look at this, I've already touched upon this. Let's say that your assets are being used to infringe upon others' rights. In most cases, they do not want to help infringement of rights, so they would want something to be blocked. They don't want to help infringement of rights. But for the telecommunication operator, what is their position? And if we look at this, around the year 2000, there was the responsibility of the service provider that was looked at, and there was about 3 different study group meetings that were carried out. In 1996, for utilization, there was a study group, and then in 1997, there was a study on the information distribution rules. And in 1999, there was a study group in regard to information distribution over the internet. So, in regard to contents and the relationship of the providers to this, and the involvement of their facilities in contents, a very detailed study was made by these 3 study groups. I will not go into the details, but when it comes to the appropriate distribution of information for the first study group, in the EU law, it was taken into consideration that the service provider was divided into 3 different types: the conduit, the cash providers, and the service providers. But in the case of Japan, it's necessary to divide it into the 3 different categories, but for each provider, depending on the format of the services, what are the content possibilities are looked at, and the situation of the management, and depending on circumstances, the accountability and so on are looked at. But in specific cases, though, there is the safe harbor that is determined, and it's convenient for service providers when they move forward with the business. And this resulted with the limitation on liability of service providers. And then for the conduit providers and the access providers, if it is possible to have explicit knowledge, then they could say that they would not be party to wider distribution of illegal content. At that time, when discussions were carried out, for smoothly moving forward, they came up with a conclusion of this nature. That is my feeling on this matter. Another aspect, when it comes to the interpretation of this secrecy of communications, this seems to become inflated, and there is the problem that it may not fit the needs of modern society. Professor Obinata has mentioned, but it's necessary to understand the contents to understand the illegality. But when it comes to international communications, we have the example of Australia, so it's easy to understand. But when it comes to international communications and the involvement of the Constitution and the telecommunication business law, there may be an inflated state of this. That is my feeling about the problem. And in order to confirm the illegality, or looking into this, there is the Constitution and also the relationship of that with the Telecommunication Business Act. And when it comes to the infringement on the Telecommunication Business Act, there is the cases of stealing or the acquisition of knowledge or leakage, and the general interpretation is in regard to the utilization is looked at, and it becomes very difficult to explain this in English. But this, if misuse is construed as use, then that is how the interpretation is explained. And so that means that this is subject to what is referred to as an inflated or fat interpretation. And so in regard to the confirmation or so on, there is one position that can be taken that it's an infringement. Meanwhile, I think that it may be an interpretation that is too inflated and not suitable for modern society. And so, through means such as court order and so on, it's necessary to consider what the service provider is subject to. At any rate, I don't know whether this is a very old matter, but in this regard, when I was involved initially in the internet, These are matters that I explained, that I experienced real time. And there was a committee on information distribution rule in electronic communication service in 1997. And in regard to the regulations on the secrecy of communication and the obligations and the relationship between all these obligations, there was a report that covered all of this. And when it comes to one-to-one communication, then there is the secrecy of communication that would not be applicable in such a case. And within that report, the originator may be informed about the communication rights that are infringed upon. And there was a question about whether that is a violation of the secrecy of communication. And when it comes to one-to-one communication, so this would not be an infringement of secrecy of communications according to the reply that was made in a case. So stopping the utilization or deletion and the subject of site blocking can be considered in the same light. But within this report, site blocking is naturally not referred to it as at all. But when it comes to legal interests, in regard to an opinion on this, for censorship and provision of services, this becomes a focal point. And so when it comes to information, there are cases where service cannot be provided. And in such a case, there may be certain types of information that can be stopped. Within the report, there's a summary of all of those elements. One point that is subject to debate is when it comes to the Constitution or the Telecommunication Business Act, what about overseas communication that comes to Japan? Unfortunately, it's just my paper that talks about the legal aspects of this, and unfortunately, the government report cannot quote my paper and provide this to you. But at any rate, when it comes to the Constitution and the secrecy of communication in the Telecommunication Business Act, and what about the infringements that would be involved there, for those who are negative about site blocking, there had not been any thought perhaps given to this, but there needs to be some preparation for this. And there is a fundamental right of the secrecy of communication that comes up. And another way of looking at this is that when it comes to blocking, what about the domestic telecommunication operators' communication among themselves? Now, what about the handling of telecommunication providers? When it comes to overseas telecommunication business operators coming, before they came to Japan, there's zero protection level in Japan. And all of a sudden, when you come to Japan, does the protection level become 100%? Well, that's strange to look at. And it's a matter of interpretation of law. But when it comes to the handling of the telecommunication business operator, those who are licensed by the telecommunication business law would be subject to this. And for the Constitution, Japan has a constitutional law, but to what extent does that apply? And these are the points debated as to the extent covered by the Constitution. If we look at the precedents, then there's the 2016 precedent, and when it comes, I believe that there is an opinion on my part in regard to sovereignty and in regard to how this could be actually applied. If you look at the upper left-hand side, this is Japan. And you can see this wall. There's a thick wall that protects Japan. That's fine. But there are pirates that are able to access valuable assets. And other countries could take an approach that would balance things out, in which case I don't know whether it's because of cholesterol, but there's a fat wall. If we could slim that, but still, for basic rights, for incidental or collateral damage, the minimal steps should be taken, but some appropriate resizing of the walls should be carried out. But the problem here is the issue of excessive blocking, or whether the system has transparency or not, or whether remedy is immediately possible, or is it truly implementable. We have to be evidence-based as we look at a healthy mechanism for law. We have to think about that. In other words, in 2018, there was a tragedy. And in the 23rd of April, this implementation was not well considered. Preparations were inadequate. And the debate after that, from my viewpoint, did not have the accurate rationale in law and the necessary debate. The basic debate necessary by legal experts was not carried out. And so we must be aware that the victims are going to be the people of Japan, and we should be clear about whether we are in opposition or supporting an approach, and we must take a well-balanced approach. And we need economic analysis and also a comparative analysis. But at any rate, we need to take these steps to come up with the best solution possible. In 2018, the debate, from my viewpoint, cannot be said to be adequate at all. In fact, now it's necessary to carry out legal debate on a rational basis. The time has come for this to take place. That is my position. And in this regard, when I was invited to speak here, I mentioned about the report of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, and as follow-up, I found materials on this, and I hope that this will be of reference for you. With those words, I would like to express my gratitude for being provided with this opportunity. Thank you very much. Mr. Takahashi, thank you very much. On the 9th of December, a more detailed report will be provided, and if you are going to be interested in this, please attend this event of the intellectual property rights, and we'll have a panel discussion, but we have to rearrange the stage. So we would like to request your patience until we are ready with the stage, and there's coffee available in the lobby. Thank you.
それではセッティング
Now we are ready for the next part of the program, which is a panel discussion. As I introduce the panelists, to the right, Mr. Tomohiro Toyama of TMI Associates. Mr. Toyama, in 1986, became the first head of the Japan office of MPA America. And since that time, he has been supporting our activities of JIMCA as well. Professor Obinata, Professor Takahashi, they are on the panel as well. Also, Professor Austin is joining us remotely, online. Professor Austin, thank you for joining us again. Now, Professor Austin is on the video there, so please talk to him. As you can see his face on the screen. I hand over to you, Toyama-san. I am Toyama, attorney at law, following the last year. So site blocking is the theme handled in this seminar for the third time, I think. As was introduced just earlier, 36 years ago, toward the end of 1985, MPA asked me to open the Japan office of MPA to eradicate piracy around the world. So I tried to find an office and set up an office. And since then, I have been involved in eradication of piracies. Since we are running short of time, and I have to join a web meeting with overseas colleagues at 4:45. So we have to end this program, including question session, before then. Now, Professor Austin is joining us too. So this is going to be a very international panel discussion. Many years ago, the first seminar, when we had a panel discussion 10-some years ago, what I said at that time, the act of stealing things. I talked about the consciousness about stealing things. At that time, I talked about the Asuka period, the oldest law in Japan, Taiho Ritsuryo, and there is a penalty imposed, like banging with a stick, and also the deportation, and also the death penalty. So since that time, this is the period of Asuka, Nara, and Heian. Agriculture produce was extremely precious and valuable products. Therefore, agricultural devices, stealing such devices would tantamount to death penalty back then. So stealing things have become blurred because in 1984, Sony Datamax case arose, and from the TV, you can record programs on TV. This can be done free of charge. So everybody can do that free of charge. So that movies which are aired on the TV can be recorded, and that act should be free of charge, people thought. So in this way, such an act has become rampant, and therefore they didn't think this act is a stealing. So it's not the theft. So back then, the producing or copying pirated videos. There are such operators many, and I was saying that this is like forging money. In the age of internet, you are now able to see anything on the internet, and in some cases, you can record anything on the internet, so that we are able to copy production and also see it anytime. So from the user perspective, this was very convenient. So this is the highest challenge. Now, site blocking. Who are the victims of site blocking? Not only copyright holders, but also users or consumers. When they download a product, they can be done repeatedly. 2 million yen of fines or the jail term of 2 years can be imposed. However, users are not aware. We have to protect users from committing such a act of offense as well. So, Professor Austin, I have a question to you. Professor Austin, in your presentation, you talked about 4 elements. The measures that limit human rights must be prescribed by law, be in pursuit of a legitimate objective, be rationally connected to its stated objective, and be a proportionate way to achieve that objective. So the 4th point is quite difficult to understand. Let me ask you a question. Proportionate way, proportionate response to achieve that activity. And in Japanese translation, the word proportionate literally was used. And you talked about proportionality. And Obinata-san also talked about proportionality as well. So, in the case, if the number of voters who supported LVP, and we have proportional representation system based on the votes gained, I understand that. However, in this context, what is proportionate?
Very much for participating.
Should I speak now? Is this?
ね、ちょっとタイムディレイがありますね。
It's a very, very good question. And there really isn't a clear answer. There are different meanings of proportionality. It's a principle, a well-known principle in European Union jurisprudence. It's the principle that was applied, for example, in the Court of Justice of the EU case, the Telecable case that was mentioned by one of the other speakers. So proportionality has a number of elements to it, but one way of thinking about it, and they are many, is that the intrusion on the right is proportionate to the harm that the measure is seeking to address. So we would ask, in the context of privacy, the right to a fair trial, the right to freedom of expression, and so on, whether the inroad, the infringement on the right is appropriate in the light of the harm that the measure is directed at. In this case, massive online infringement via pirate websites. So this is interesting in terms of legislative design. I mean, proportionality is not a well-known or well-developed principle in the common law system. But when the Australian legislature adopted the blocking order legislation in 2015 and then amended it in 2018, it wrote into the legislation the requirement that among the factors that a judge could consider is the proportionality of the response. In the United Kingdom equivalent provision, For example, in the United Kingdom copyright legislation, it has a blocking order regime, but it does not have proportionality written into the legislation because it did not have to. The United Kingdom courts then could borrow from the European jurisprudence on proportionality, which scrutinizes, as I say, the inroad on the rights against the end that is sought to be achieved. In Australia, where we don't have proportionality as a background constitutional principle, it had to be written into the legislation. What's happening now is this Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights is now using the European Union proportionality approach. How serious is the harm that is being addressed by the blocking order legislation versus how serious is the inroad into the right? It's using that as a background to its analysis. So in terms of legislative design, it's very interesting to see the Australian Parliament expressly stating what the European the Court of Justice of the European Union did in the Telecable case. And just remember that in the Telecable case, the Court of Justice of the European Union said that a appropriately limited blocking order was an appropriately proportionate response. I hope that's helpful.
ありがとうございました。ハームの守るべき利益の部分の
So the harm and the interest is compared, it seems. I believe that's...
To proportionality, yes.
Would there be another English word like equitable or well balanced or?
Yes, that's a controversial question for constitutional scholars. One approach certainly to proportionality is to think about the balancing of rights, the balancing of intellectual property rights as against the right to freedom of expression and the right to privacy and so on. That's one approach to proportionality. Is it a balanced response? The more conventional response is to think about the legislation, the measure, and then ask, is the inroad on the right proportionate in the light of the mischief that is sought to be prevented here? Infringement of copyright. The reason why I am reluctant to embrace the idea of balancing is in the copyright context, it suggests that protection of authors and freedom of expression are in opposition to each other. And there is literature indicating that they're not, the public interest is reflected in copyright law. Copyright law encourages the production of speech, encourages the production of expression. So to see copyright in opposition to the right to freedom of expression is not, I think, accurately capturing the public interest at stake. There is a strong public interest in artists and authors leading dignified lives where they can make an income, and in having access to those productions that are protected by copyright.
ありがとうございました。オースティン教授の
In the presentation by Professor Austin for the infringement on the secrecy of communications, there had not been any explanation because perhaps there was no debate on this matter in Australia. But when it comes to the secrecy of communications, in Japan, for those who oppose site blocking, that is the main point that is asserted. And I'd like to ask Professor Austin, in Australia, was there no debate at all in regard to secrecy of communications?
None that turns up in the official literature. That's for sure. Article 17 on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights certainly refers to communications, the origin of the secrecy of communication right in modern jurisdictions and in modern jurisprudence. If I could throw this back and ask a question of my own, is I am struggling to see what the secrecy of communication issue really is. And I'll put it this way. So if you can think about site blocking legislation at a number of stages. So first of all, there's the question of jurisdiction. How does a court get the jurisdiction to make the order? There are a number of factors, and we see this in the Singaporean regime, we see this in the Australian regime, and also in the UK and European Union regime. First of all, there has to be a site in the Australian regime. It has to be a foreign origin site. That can be tricky, but courts deal with that, assuming it's a foreign origin site and it's a site that whose purpose or effect is to facilitate copyright infringement. Now, at that point, you can assess that without going anywhere near anyone's private information. The Australian courts, as I mentioned, have said that you can assess the nature of the site simply by test downloads by the applicants themselves. You don't have to know about any individual's use of the site to get jurisdiction. And then there comes the question of implementation of the order. And this is where I found the presentations from my co-panelists so fascinating and so rich and interesting. Because the processes that the internet service providers put in place at the direction of the court, the court instructs the ISP how to go about it. And again, it's difficult to see how the use of personal data infringes the secrecy of communication. So if I am I'm an internet subscriber, I key in the IP address of an infringing website. Yes, that information can be seen by the ISP, they can discover it, but in reality this is achieved through an automated process where the ISP sets up an automated process that tests subscribers' requests for site against a list of sites that are ordered by the court to be blocked. At that point, it's difficult to see how this implicates the right to secrecy, unless you say just the mere just having the information that I went to this website or I tried to go to this website is itself implicates the right. But of course, ISPs have that information anyway. It's exactly the same process as one of the speakers mentioned, or can be exactly the same process that is used for child pornography sites, but also even ISPs themselves implement those kinds of automated processes for sites at which there is malware. So now, I would completely agree that if at this point the ISP disclosed that information, we have a privacy question. But the mere testing of my request to go to a site against an automated list of sites seems to me to be, it seems quite a stretch, just as an Australian New Zealand lawyer, to see that as implicating secrecy rights, because ISPs do this all the time in other contexts, particularly at the edge of the web in terms of protecting against preventing people from going to sites that have malware, for example.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. I have been thinking about this. When it comes to the IP addresses of piracy sites, why does that become an infringement of the secrecy of communications? And I don't understand that either. So I'd like to ask Professor Obinata, in slide 11 of your presentation. There was whether it was prescribed by law, whether it's justified, objective, and are there the subjects of blocking limited? Is there a restriction of personal information to the scope required? You mentioned about those are the points that are necessary to look at when considering site blocking. Now, Professor Austin has explained about 4 items which are completely similar to what you've cited. And also, there is Professor Shishido of the University of Tokyo, who is an acquaintance of mine, who opposes site blocking. And when looking at points 1, 2, 3, and 4, whether it has been legislated or not, what about achieving a greater public good, and also is there a rational relationship between the purpose, and are there other measures that could be implemented? And it seems to be similar, but Professor Obinata, what are your comments on this? Yes. In regard to my comments, as well as Professor Obinata and as well as Professor Shishido, I think that these are similar points, and these are points that need to be considered. But in regard to Professor Shishido's paper, as well as Professor Austin's paper, it was pointed out that they are similar. And in the case of Professor Shishido, in regard to the matter of site blocking, there are constitutional rights that may be limited. And so in order to establish the standards for this, there needs to be an interim examination necessary. And it should not be stringent nor loose. And it's common sense. I can understand that point. For example, when it comes to the restraint on freedom of expression, it's not whether the expression is that problem or not. It's whether something is a dead copy of something else. And when it comes to the limitation on the freedom of communication, it's not looking at the contents, but rather it's just the meta data that is looked at. And so there's a different interpretation. It was very much common sense that is applied. Thank you.
I have another question. Earlier, as I said, those who are opposing to site blocking, according to them, site blocking without consent of users, the IP address or access destinations of infringing sites are detected without consent of users. Therefore, it is violating secrecy of communication. Everybody opposing to site blocking is saying that unanimously. However, IP address of infringing sites can be known without any investigation by right holder as well. Therefore, if that's the case, right holders know this, have this knowledge in advance, and if there is a law in place on that premise with a court decision, if we are to block the sites, it will not infringe upon secrecy of communication, in my view. What is your view, Obinata Sensei, Professor Obinata Sen, where the site blocking is infringing upon secrecy of communication? That is a tough question. According to Professor Takahashi, we are in the Galapagos Island, I think. So in a nutshell, the acquisition of knowledge, the act of acquiring knowledge, that is not related only to infringing sites. In the course of business, that can happen. However, that acquisition of knowledge, if that happens in the course of normal business, can be considered illegal. However, in Japan, that can be allowed as long as it is for legitimate tourism. That means that otherwise, acquisition of knowledge is illegal. So that is the argument. Maybe this is Galapagos, but I don't know for sure. Thank you very much. Takahashi-san's presentation material, in the beginning, I was surprised that word you use, Galapagos. It says the secrecy of communication in Galapagos Islands. Takahashi-san, I think this is a very good phraseology. With what intent did you use this? Galapagos explanation. I have actually prepared a slide to show you to explain this. Could you click that? Can you read that? Next one. 4 things, 4 clicks. Can you understand what that is? These are the names of countries in the world. Let me give you answer. Portugal, from above, Austria, Hungary, Sweden. So these are the names of countries with Japanese characters. So among these 4 countries, and also we have Argentina, and other countries. Then, can I have the next slide? Now, actually, the radio communication law, in making this law, we used the whole laws of these countries as a model. You can know more about it on the internet. And also this is different from the official interpretation of the MIC's interpretation today. So in the days where internet was absent, we were scrutinizing in detail the laws of other countries to learn and find what was the best law to be enacted in Japan. Therefore, our predecessors, who we respect, did such an exercise when internet was not available. They did such a research. They made a tremendous effort to learn from other countries. So frankly speaking, we see a lot of problems on the internet today, and we have to do something about it. However, Japan is saying that we are ahead of other countries. However, EU's telecable case decision, do you know? But they don't know. I think this is quite powerful message. So as jurists, as long as we say we are professional lawyers, we have to be more reserved. And that's what I want to say by Galapagos expression. So we have to do something for the benefits of the public, because we have these predecessors who worked so hard, and based on their spirit, we have to do the same amount of research. That is what I wanted to convey in the word I used as a Galapagos Island. So let's take a step forward. Some ministry in Japan, if it takes more innovative steps, maybe we don't have to be Galapagos. Would you like to say that extent? I'm not talking about ministries. However, if the third interpretation that I mentioned earlier, that was done by a certain ministry in order to protect their own interest. So I think their attitude is in a sense reasonable, because if there is an order which is not very clear, then the providers which they are supervising will be at a loss. So if that happens, the ministry has to defend such industry at the ministry-wide mission. So I think that is parochial, and we have to have a higher perspective. And right holders, we have to have dialogue with the right holders, and at the political level, we have to establish a more balanced system with open-minded approach, using the evidence from various countries which have experience. So balanced approach is necessary. I think that is the right course to move into, in my view. Thank you very much. Another question to Takahashi Sensei. What was interesting was a forward pass of American football example. So are you talking about rugby or football? We have to clarify which one are we talking about. Otherwise, we will be passing by each other all the time. And there are pros and cons. And so I think that Professor Austin's laughing too. Rugby, American football. We have to make it clear. In 2018, we are having such a blurred discussion, unclear discussion, whether we didn't know we are talking about rugby or football. And I think that joke passed by international interpretation as well. Now, so MPA conducted a survey, as Professor Watanabe made a report earlier, from Japan, monthly visits to infringing sites from Japan, more than 100,000 visits. We have 3,107 sites with such access. Currently, 600 million access on a month. We have illegal access. So this is all, it's not all about downloading of films from illegal sites. However, so many people are downloading films in an illegal manner. So when it comes to site blocking, how about America? What's happening in America is always being asked. So in terms of law, there is no law allowing site blocking. What America is doing, so they are seeking cooperation with ISPs in the United States. So they are exploring the way to cooperate. So Google is conducting a delisting now. And so perhaps site blocking legislation is a possibility in the future in the US as well. But I think there are two things. Why is it that in Japan, are we always conscious about what's happening in the United States? If this is a good thing, we have to do it without following suit in the United States. And also, we have to consider outreach activities. So from the user side, we have to raise awareness of users as well. So in Japan, in the pandemic, as you can see, everybody wears masks and also they wash hands. So COVID situation is completely different from other countries. So I think outreach activity is necessary, not only focusing on opponent sides, we have to focus on general consumers as well. Let me have a brief last comments from everybody.
First of all, in regard to trends that are taking place in America, as Professor Austin may know, there's some special treatment there, and so it's necessary to do the right kind of survey. And it's like clinical trials and clinical examples in the case of medicine. So taking that into consideration in the age of the internet, everybody is facing the same problems, and so the solutions should converge in a similar direction. That's my belief. And so in order to do that, we have to take more positive steps. We should not consider Japan as being special and leaving it at that. I believe that we are going to be lost if we take that approach. Professor Obinata, within the explanation by Professor Takashi's mentioned about the fact that constitutional experts and other experts should be more active in the debate. So I keenly aware about this.
Like 2 minutes. Any remark, please?
Thank you again for the opportunity. With rugby, there is another term that is called the hospital pass. I don't know if that's idiomatic, but that's when somebody throws you the ball and a big guy is going to come down on you and you're going to end up in hospital. And I sometimes worry that the absence of site blocking orders is like giving the content providers a hospital pass in rugby. Just a final comment on the point about the United States. I hope I'm not offending Mr. Lang here, but when thinking about measures that are adopted or not adopted, it's important to take into account how functional the legislature is at a particular time. And getting legislation passed, I'll put this neutrally, is easier in some countries than others. And so the arrangements between content providers and ISPs may be a substitute for legislation, but they are not necessarily ideal. The seminar, I think, very interestingly looked at human rights implications. At the end, we're talking about the rule of law. One advantage of the Australian process is that the judiciary are involved, and the approach to site blocking is made public through the legislation and through a detailed parliamentary process. When thinking about this, the value for advancing the rule of law in a public legislated process where the judiciary are in control should be taken seriously.
ありがとうございます。ぜひ、
Thank you very, very much. What everybody should think about is that what is being attempted in site blocking is to recognize the fact that there is unauthorized use of other people's contents. It's notorious. Notorious people are doing evil acts, and site blocking is a means to stop this. And so therefore, it's necessary to recognize this once again. And also, when it comes to the secrecy of communications, what does it infringe? How is it being infringed? Everybody should think about this. And we're already past 25 minutes past the hour. But if there's one question, we can take perhaps just one question from the audience. If not, we will close off. Thank you very much. Mr. Toyama, thank you very much. And Professor Takahashi, Professor Obinata, and Professor Austin, thank you very much. Once again, let's offer them a big round of applause. And please return to your seats. For the 34th Tokyo International Film Festival, we have this event, the MPA Seminar, and we would like to thank you for your participation. And we have the supporting person, acting chairperson of the LDP Policy Research Council, Secretary General of the League of Diet Ministers for the Promotion of Culture and Arts, and former foreign minister. And I'd like to read his comments. I would like to offer my heartfelt congratulations upon the holding of the Tokyo International Film Festival event, the 11th MPA Seminar. I've been participating every year at this event, and this seminar has provided many suggestions about the protection of film copyrights and the dissemination of copyright thinking. Therefore, this event has provided valuable things to study about. It is regrettable that I'm unable to attend this event, but I hope it will be a very fruitful one, and I would like to express my gratitude to all who made the efforts to hold this event, and hope that everyone will continue to enjoy the best of health. From Shintaro Ito, member of the House of Representatives. And we would like to thank Mr. Ito for his message. And with that, we would like to close off the MPA Seminar, which is being held in conjunction with the Tokyo International Film Festival. And with this, we would like to close off this event. Thank you very much. And we would like to thank the Tokyo International Film Festival, as well as the U.S. Embassy in Japan, and Jimco. Thank you. And I would like to thank everybody for participating here, as well as those who are accessing this event online. Thank you. And we'll be collecting the interpretation receivers at the exit. Thank you very much.